Hi everyone, in this video we're going to be looking at using patterns of light and shadow to simplify a complex subject. Let's have a look. Hi guys, welcome. My name's Tom. In this video we're going to look at one way that we can simplify what may appear to be quite a complex subject. This way of looking at and thinking about our subject could be applied to anything, but in this case we're going to look at the painting of a cheetah. So here, with such a big distraction of the spots and the features and seemingly a lot of detail, plus an interesting pose and a strong feeling of light, I found it very easy to feel overwhelmed at the thought of tackling this subject. But I will talk you through my thought process while looking at analysing and interpreting this subject. Then we will look at the painting process itself and how we can translate that thought process into an actual working painting. For me, simplification of the subject using simple patterns of light and shadow is the key. I try to look kind of beyond the detail and look for large areas of similar tonal values or the same tonal values. And this is regardless of what they actually represent. It's almost trying to look in a different way than we might be used to. The main way I do this is to squint or to blur my eyes, which firstly takes out all of the details, and secondly it tends to meld together areas of similar tonal values into much larger, easy to understand shapes. So whatever the subject is, it's these simple, easy to understand shapes that I am looking to break the subject down into. It's kind of like large jigsaw pieces that slot together to give the illusion of our subject. These shapes need to be accurate, but that is different from complex, and one of my personal little painting mantras is simple but accurate shapes. Once I've established these in my mind, I then start to ask the question, what is the dominant tonal value of this shape? There may well be areas within a shape that are darker or lighter than the average or overall tonal value, but again, squinting or blurring our eyes can really help with this by condensing everything down tonally, and it's basically taking out a lot of the visual noise. Then, to make things even simpler, I generally ask of a shape, is it a light, a dark, or somewhere in between, a mid-tone? If it's a mid-tone, then is it a darker mid-tone, more like a kind of deep shadow, or is it a lighter mid-tone that is creating some sort of variety of value and form within a more lit area? So analysing things in this way not only makes tackling this tricky subject much easier, but for me it also becomes a much more fun process as we can begin to step away from directly copying the reference photo. We can begin to use it more as like a jumping off point, and then a guide to refer back to if needed. This actually then becomes a far less stressful way of working, because I no longer feel like I have to compare what I'm painting to the subject, and I start to think about the painting as having its own identity and its own life, and one that is inspired by and influenced by the reference or the subject, but is also separate from it. And this reminds me of one of my favourite quotes from Joseph Zbukvic: don't compete with your subject because you will lose every time. Love that quote, and it's very, very true. So to summarise, a large part of what I'm trying to do here is to distill this subject down into its simplest form. For me, this is the large general shapes, simple but accurate, establish an overall kind of tonal value, at least in our own minds. Then we want to start to think about any subtle variations of tone and then any smaller shapes within these larger ones. This can be slightly trickier with watercolour, as we are generally not adding lighter colours on top of dark, but still having the concept in our minds is a huge part of my own painting process, and it's always going to help our painting. And then secondly, the way that watercolour flows together within kind of wet and damp areas does naturally create kind of variation anyway, if we just let it alone and leave it to do its thing. So let's quickly take one last look at the study of the cheetah, then dive into the painting itself. So overall, I wanted to keep the big areas of simple tones much as they are. What I'm really doing here is experimenting with the tonal value of the spots. So although we know the spots are black, in the deep shadow areas, I make the spots very dark. As we move into some of the lighter areas, I then take the not the black, but actually the darker shadow tone, and use those to represent the spots. And then we move into the really light areas. I use the next step up in lighter tone to create the spots. So I'm not using the deep black for the spots within the light area. I think this has the potential to make it much more interesting. I think it will give it much more form and variety than using just deep black spots everywhere. So that's kind of the major consideration on top of that. But hopefully you can see that this still really holds together tonally. We have a very strong feeling of deep shadow, and we have a lovely vibrant feeling of light. Things like the spots, the eye, the nose, these are still abstract shapes, but they're kind of decorations on top of the underlying very, very simple patterns of light and shadow. The very big shapes of simple tonal values, slowly but surely broken up into smaller shapes as we go. But ultimately, actually, those big shapes really do remain an integral part of the painting, and that's why I always try to think about them as best I can, even as the painting progresses right towards the end and the little details at the end. Those big shapes of similar tone need to remain underpinning the painting to make it work and to hold it together. So I hope that makes sense. Let's have a little look at the painting in action and how we're going to implement this with the watercolour. So I kick off with a nice kind of watery tea coffee mix of new gamboge mixed with a little bit of Aussie red gold, just kind of warms it up a little bit. You could easily add a touch of red to do the same. What I'm really trying to do here is establish kind of the overall form of the animal with some of the lighter tones. So I'm purposely trying to leave that kind of lighter slice through the middle of the animal, leave lots of whites of the page for the highlights, kind of hitting the front edge of the mouth, the top of the shoulder, certainly the back end of the animal. And then while that's still wet, kind of break into the background, introduce a little bit of green and a few wet into wet spots. I don't go mad with that, but certainly in the background I want things to be a little softer and less determinate. The next thing, once that's bone dry, is I come in with my kind of shadow mid-tone now. I pick a nice mixture of mid-tone and I just tackle a shape at a time, almost like the jigsaw pieces that you saw earlier on in the video. I'm tackling just the shadow side of the head. I get a big wash down very quickly. I then look for variation of tone and colour within it, but very subtle variations, not big jumps of tone. I leave the differentiation between the light side and the shadow side quite strong, and then whilst this is drying, i.e. it's still wet, I drop in some darker tones, like a kind of darker mix of quinacridone red, a stronger concentration. And then as this is further dry, I drop in my really strong mix of almost neat kind of double cream, if not kind of Marmite paint, phthalo blue and a red gives us this. So that's kind of tackled that strong shadow shape on the side of the head, and I've kept, as I say, that very big differentiation between the shadow shape and the light shape. Yes, we're making it more complex by adding tonal variety, but underpinning that is that big, strong, simple shape of shadow. And the watercolour does a lot of the work for you. A watercolour creates a lot of natural variation. Probably one of the biggest areas of simplification using tone here is this bit that I'm working on now. So in the actual photo, the reference, the cheetah, there's quite a lot of variation of tone in there and a lot of very similar tones to some of the lighter aspects of the animal. But I choose to make it a very, very simple, unified area of shadow. Again, yes, there's subtlety of tone in there and subtlety of colour created by the medium and with a little bit more purpose to it, but it's much, much simpler tonally than the reference photo, because I want to draw attention to the head and where the light is hitting. I don't want to make it too complex in this area. As this area continues to dry, I then drop in the spots. I really try to think about the way that those spots go around the form of the body, and because I'm in a shadow area, I know that I can drop down to a nice deep dark. Some of those spots get a little bit lighter, a little bit more reddy as we drop down to the leg. And then notice now I'm starting to put a few spots in the light areas. Those spots are lighter tonally than the spots in the shadow area. I'm now going to the back hind area and I'm treating this again as its own very simple independent shape. It's a lighter shadow that's cooler, but it's still like a dominant shadow colour. And then as that kind of dries, I drop in some more spots. We get that kind of wet kind of soft feeling to the spots, so it recedes a little bit more, and then start to bring in the spots in a slightly sharper way over the top of the initial wash, and then the very final touches are kind of around the eye to bring it all to life. So hopefully you can see that we've ended up with a really atmospheric kind of painting, very soft, a slightly cooler in the background. It becomes sharper and slightly more complex and defined and refined in the foreground, and it kind of stretches the distance and the form of the animal. So let's have a quick look now at the reference photo and my kind of quick tonal study next to the final painting, and talk a little bit more about how we've translated those into a final painting. Okay, so let's start in the foreground. So the side of the head and that front kind of shoulder area and the front legs, you can see in the tonal study that I made that all one very simple shadowy mid-tone. I then tackled the shadow of the head as one very simple shape to start with, but kind of simple but accurate, really focusing on the way that it connects with the light shape. Naturally using the watercolour to create that variation that gives it a little bit more realism than just the tonal study, and that little bit of variation of colour. I then take that exact same mixture, so the same tone, the same colour, and I bring it, and this is where, as I said, we really simplified the subject. If you look at the photo in the bottom left, you can see there's a huge amount of variation in that kind of front shoulder area and the front legs. I have got some variation both tonally and colour wise, but it's much simpler. I've taken my lead from the head, really simplified this area so that it doesn't distract from the head and the light hitting the side of the body, made it much simpler. And then as again that's drying, I drop in the darker mixtures. That naturally creates variety and softness, which helps the area kind of demand less attention, and so our eye as the viewer and our attention as the viewer is drawn to the much sharper and higher contrast areas of like the light down the front of the nose and that sort of thing. So those are the two initial areas, very much simplified tonally, a very simple process of dark shadowy mid-tone first, create a little bit of variation using the natural kind of properties of the medium, then drop in the darker tones. Now, moving into the kind of barrel-like chest area, ribcage area just behind the head, there's that little patch of lighter mid-tone shadow that traps the light on the front of the nose, and there's a little kind of ridge of it which you can see in the tonal study, and I've used it similarly in the actual painting, almost imagining it like a tube with a highlight shooting across the middle of it, so that the extreme light is hitting this kind of middle area just left of the forehead, and the spots there are lighter and warmer in tone and colour than the spots in the shadows. And then very finally, I then kind of treat the hind legs even more simply really than the tonal study. I just treat that as one very simple shape. I don't make it as dark as the shadow tone in the tonal study, so the shadow in the back legs is not as dark as the shadow in the front legs. That was a decision that I made as I went along to create a bit more depth, a bit more atmosphere, to kind of push it back in the painting a little bit more. But the underlying principle is the same. I lay in a very simple shadow shape that's darker than the light shape, and as that dries I drop in the kind of slightly darker tone of the spots. But again, the spots there are cooler than the foreground, and they're also nowhere near as dark as the spots in the foreground. So again, it's kind of depth and atmosphere. So to really summarize then, we've kind of got the head split into a light and a shadow shape. We've got the front legs and the shoulder area split into a predominantly a shadow shape with a little bit of light, so that's only really two shadow shapes so far. We've got two shadow shapes on the rib cage and the top of the back there, leaving a nice light shape in the middle. We've again got a kind of slightly more abstract light shape for the back legs with a strong shadow shape there. So the number of shapes that I'm working with, and I worked on them independently despite the fact we've created a unified painting, the number of shapes is very simple, and it allows me then to focus in on an area and work kind of wet into wet within that area, create that lovely variation, create that lovely transparency and softness that watercolour is so great for. It's learning to mix the colours and similar tones that allows us to kind of make the painting harmonise and work together. So we've taken a complex subject, we've initially really simplified it down in our study, we've really simplified it down in the initial stages of the painting, and then slowly brought up the complexity just a little bit, but nowhere near as much as the initial photo. Don't forget, you can hop over to my Patreon page and watch a much longer narrated time lapse of this, where I go much more into detail and depth of the actual process and the colour mixing. Links in the description. So there we go, guys. As always, I hope that made some sort of sense, and hopefully it helped show at least one way that we can simplify a complex subject. In this case, using simple patterns of light and shadow done by breaking our subject up into large shapes and then asking what tonal value are they, then breaking these larger shapes up into smaller ones. How far you go with this kind of approach or this principle is up to you, because even hyper-realistic paintings, for example, this is still the same principle of shapes broken up into smaller shapes, just going much, much further with the process. Whereas I like to stop breaking it down into smaller shapes a lot further back in the process. So I guess it's kind of more abstracted and it has that slightly more painterly feel, but the principles are still basically the same. If you enjoyed this and found it useful, please do consider subscribing. There's going to be loads more videos to come, and don't forget to hit the bell for notifications. Like, shares and comments, they do really help me out, as well as letting me know what sort of content you're enjoying and you might want to see more of. Links to all the other places you can find me, including my Patreon teaching channel, will all be linked in the description below, as well as links to some upcoming Zoom demonstrations, which will also be kind of an ongoing thing. Until next time, guys, happy creating, happy living, and I will catch you soon.